Welcome back to another video, everyone. Today I'll be giving my thoughts on the Kailh Box Royal switches and doing a sound comparison between these and some other tactile switches so you can figure out which one might be best for you. Starting from the outside, these switches look very similar to other box switches I've used before. They have the classic square-shaped palm stem that helps to reduce stem wobble, and they feature a polycarbonate top housing and a nylon bottom housing with 3 pins on the bottom for plate mounting. Unfortunately, if you were hoping to mount these directly to a PCB, you might be out of luck, but it's not a big deal to me personally. The clear plastic top housing allows light to shine through it, but it doesn't do as great of a job at diffusing that light as some of the other switches I've used. These are only SMD compatible and not compatible with other LEDs like through-hole. Taking a look inside the switch, we see the traditional box design that covers the contact leaf and the small protruding plastic piece that interacts with the stem to actually register a key press when you use a switch. The box design makes these switches IP56 waterproof and dustproof, so I guess they'd be good for you if you're prone to spilling stuff pretty often. Right out of the box, these switches are very smooth and they wouldn't really benefit from lubing them due to the lack of contact points and friction inside box switches. If we take the stem out, you'll see that the shape of the bump has a ramp with a relatively sharp point on it. This creates a very noticeable and sharp tactile event, but interestingly enough, it's not the biggest reason why these have more tactility over some of the other Kailh box switches. In a traditional MX style tactile switch, the size of the bump on the stem determines how tactile that switch is going to be. For example, we can look at the difference between a cherry brown and a cherry gray and see a noticeable difference in the stems. The cherry gray is a more tactile switch, so you can see the larger protrusion on the stem legs. However, with the Box Royal switches, Kailh opted for a stiffer contact leaf to create more tactility as opposed to making the stem protrusion wider. This gives it a unique resistance compared to other tactile switches I've used before, and it's a bit more satisfying in my opinion. Taking a look at the force curve for these switches, we can see that they have a 75 gram peak force with a 45 gram operating force and a 70 gram bottom out force. These are on the heavier side for tactile switches, but in my opinion, they give a comfortable typing experience without leading to fatigue from the spring weight. Since the tactility is so sharp on these switches, it's virtually impossible to press it without bottoming out. The bottom out happens very quickly on these switches in my opinion, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're pressing the switch slowly, you'll notice that there's another bump on the way back up, but it's not very noticeable when typing. These switches feature a 1.8mm actuation distance and a 3.6mm bottom out, which is fairly standard, but this leads me into possibly the biggest reason why these are some of my favorite tactile switches so far. When I've used other tactile switches before, there are normally 2 things that I don't like about the experience. The first thing is that the tactile event isn't very noticeable when I'm typing fast, so I almost feel like I'm using a linear switch that has something wrong with it. We've already covered that the Box Royals solve this by creating a sharp and noticeable tactile bump. The second thing I don't like about other tactile switches is that the stem has a noticeable amount of pre-travel before you actually encounter the bump. What I love about the Box Royal switches is that they have very minimal pre-travel, leading to a feeling that is almost like popping bubble wrap with every key press. You will always know if you press the key because the tactile bump feels like you're breaking through a small barrier as opposed to sliding over a speed bump in the road. This comes down to a matter of preference, and it might be the reason why people specifically don't like these switches, but for me this is something I noticed right away and it's probably what I like most about them. If I'm being completely honest though, there are a couple downsides to these switches. I've only been using these for a few days, but I've noticed that straight out of the box about 1 in every 10 switches has a slightly clicky sound to it. It's a super high-pitched, faint click that is barely noticeable, but it definitely sounds different than the rest of the switches. According to the Deskthority wiki, this is a common problem with the Kailh box tactile switches, but this can be alleviated by simply re-lubricating the notch on the stem. The other downside is that these have a relatively high pitch to them compared to some other switches that I've used, but that's just a matter of personal preference, I guess. Now that we've gone through the specs and my thoughts on these switches, we'll do a sound test with the Box Royals and then some comparisons with other tactile switches that I own. And there you have it. Hopefully this gave you a good idea of what to expect if you're thinking about picking up these switches. I have to say, I'm pleasantly surprised when it comes to the Box Royals, and I'll definitely be keeping these in my board until I find something I like even more. These switches are very smooth, very tactile, and very comfortable to use, but I do wish that they had a slightly deeper sound signature. If these weren't as high pitched as they are, I think they'd be almost perfect, but maybe they would sound different inside a different board. Thank you to everyone who made it this far in the video, and let me know in the comments what you think about these switches yourself. If there's something you'd like to see in the future or you think I can do better, definitely let me know. With that being said, make sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content, and I will see you all next week in the next video.